thought we would begin with a passage from the Gospel of Mark. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. Mark chapter 4. A violent squall came up, and waves were breaking over the boat. It was already filling up. Jesus was in the stern, asleep on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" He woke up, rebuked the wind, and said to the sea, "Quiet, be still." The wind ceased, and there was great calm. Then he asked them, "Why are you terrified? Do you not yet have faith?" They were filled with great awe and said to one another, "Who is this, then, whom even the wind and sea obey?" The word of the Lord, amen. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. Well, welcome back. This is our sixth year of doing these programs. So when someone was walking in and told me, "Are you tired of us yet, Charles?" I said, "No, but I'm getting tired of myself." So we forge ahead. You might recall 6 years ago we did a brief overview of the Catholic Catechism. In 2014 we did Fathers of the Church. In 2015 we did Catholic Social Teaching. In 16 we did Secularism, you might remember, and Obstacles to the Faith by those who are unchurched or not even Christian. Last year we did the Theology of Grace, remembering the 500-year anniversary of Martin Luther and the 95 Theses in 1517. This year our theme is Culture Lost, Culture Reclaimed, the Catholic Renewal, through the writings of Pope Benedict XVI. And there are more anniversaries that are related to 2018. It was a mere 50 years ago when Pope Benedict wrote a book called Introduction to Christianity, which was largely kept in libraries and maybe read by academics at that time. I had the opportunity once when Cardinal Ratzinger visited my college when I was maybe a sophomore or a junior and gave a talk about this book, which really no one had read. And somewhere in the archives of my college there's a photograph of me holding a Diet Coke and the Cardinal making a point or another, because our philosophy club sponsored a little reception for him after his talk. So there's kind of a special memory I have about this. 1968 was also the year, not only that he published this book, Introduction to Christianity, but the papal encyclical Humanae Vitae was published in July of 1968. It's probably the most talked about, least read, least preached about encyclical of all times. It's a bit like Bigfoot. There's been occasional sightings of this in Catholic preaching. It's dark and hairy and kind of scary to listen to, and it's best left not just to ignore it. But there are other anniversaries too that are more somber and more in keeping with our theme of culture lost, culture reclaimed. In 1918 was the official end of World War I, which marked the end of one age, the death of one age, and the birth of the generation that we're now in, culturally speaking. We had the Tsar and his family were assassinated in 1918 in Russia. We could go back further in time to 1818. And in China a few weeks ago, Xi Jinping, the premier of China, celebrated the 200-year anniversary of the birth of Karl Marx, noting him as the most significant thinker of the last 200 years. In China now, they are implementing something called corporate citizenship scores, whereby big data meets Marxism, and every individual in China now is scored based upon their allegiance to the China nation and Communist Party. And depending on your score, you might not be allowed to travel as much or make bank transfers, among other pleasantries associated with the 200-year anniversary. So all of this harkens to our theme tonight, which is we all have a sense of our culture is in crisis. Our culture is not what it was, particularly in the West. We feel this not only in school closings, hospital closings, the so-called shortage of priests, where every year now in the Archdiocese of Chicago, 40 priests retire, replenished by 8 to 10 new priests. And this has been going on for the last 20 years. But more than the loss of brick and mortar, there's this feeling of a spiritual crisis that we're all living through, that things are not quite as stable as we had hoped they would be in our institutions and in the church. And so, thus our theme tonight is culture lost, culture reclaimed, the Catholic renewal in the thought of Pope Benedict XVI. So if we advance, tonight's class is really about how we lost our story. And this theme was prompted by really two coincidental things that I came across in the last couple of years. One is, as you know, I direct the RCIA program here at St. Mary's, which I encourage you to recommend someone, if not yourself, to this fall's program. We already have some members coming in. But putting that aside, a few years ago, a candidate said to me, when we go around the room in the first class, "Why are you here? Why are you in RCIA?" And one of the members, the new candidate, said, "Well, I'm getting married, and I want to get the story straight for the family." So I don't know what the Catholic story is. And also an article we'll refer to later talks about how we lost our story, and nobody knows it. So thus the union of Summer School of Faith and RCIA. But we'll forge ahead. Interestingly, Pope Benedict XVI, in his book Introduction to Christianity, which is also in your bibliography, talks about Christian belief then, which has relevance for today. Courageous conviction and heroic virtue, but we also experience, and others experience, an uneasiness about the world today and living the faith in the world today. Any of you who have raised children know what I'm referring to. There's also a feeling of doubt, ignorance, and just simply feeling dislocated or at sea. And the Pope talks about a novel written in the earlier part of the 20th century by Paul Claudel, who was a French novelist. He was also a French ambassador. And the work is called The Satin Slipper, and Act 1, Scene 1 starts out with a Jesuit priest, Brother Rodrigo, who has been captured by pirates, tied to the mast of the ship, and the ship sinks, disintegrates. And all that's left is Brother Rodrigo tied to the mast of the ship floating on the ocean. And the quote here is, I will read it to you. "Lord, I thank thee for bending me down like this. It sometimes happened that I found thy commands laborious, and my will at a loss and balking at thy dispensation. But now I could not be bound to thee more closely than I am. And however violently my limbs move, they cannot get 1 inch away from thee. So I am really fastened to the cross. But the cross on which I hang is not fastened to anything else. It drifts on the sea." And in this novel, it elaborates the spiritual life of the 20th century of we cling to Jesus, and sometimes we have this feeling of darkness, of the abyss, that I'm clinging to Jesus, but I feel like I'm still at sea. There's an uneasiness, a darkness. The Pope continues in this work to talk about St. Teresa of Lisieux, the little flower, who historically has been viewed as this wonderful, touching saint of the late 20th century in France, who was this adorable, admirable saint who died young, who in some sense we felt walked maybe 6 inches above the ground, spoke of God, fully integrated in her life. There was no darkness. What is interesting is in her unedited diaries, which her order suppressed for decades, we have this. "I'm assailed by the worst temptations of atheism. Everything has become questionable. Everything is dark. It seemed only the void in certain moments of her life was what was real to her. And so this innocent saint that we all perhaps grew up with and understood and maybe read the story of a soul and these very pious musings of this innocent saint, these aspects of her diary were suppressed for about 70 years. You might recall last year I read from the diary of St. Mother Teresa of Calcutta. And her dark nights went on for 60 plus years. So things are not so simple of, yes, courageous conviction of faith, heroic virtue, and yet these saints are accompanied by this abiding darkness, it seems. This all or nothing aspect, which in fact certain philosophers talked about, like Soren Kierkegaard of the last 19th century. There's this all or nothing feel today in our culture. So the question is not, are you Catholic or are you a Lutheran? The question is, are you even a Christian or an atheist? There seems to be no middle ground allowed anymore. Your Catholic charities, you want to offer adoption services in California or Massachusetts? You're not allowed to do that anymore if you are not willing to recognize homosexual marriage and adoptive parents. You're not in the adoption business anymore as a Catholic institution. There's this either or that confronts us. So the choice is really quite stark. We could talk about mass attendance in the West continuing to decline. We can talk about the rise of people who register themselves as unaffiliated, spiritual, not religious. So this all or nothing aspect of our culture is all around us. So as the Pope continues his reflection, the challenge of belief today is really twofold. One is we believe in God who is invisible to our eyes, which is not to say that we don't experience God. It's that God is not tangible and visible to us the way that the things of nature are, or that water is wet, or that the sun is hot. So everything we think about God is our concepts or our experience in our spiritual life is always mediated by something created. We are not God. Secondly, belief comes to us, as the Pope says, in what he calls in the garb of days gone by. Sacred events, histories, customs, expressions from the ancient world, from the Old and New Testament. And we are asked to ally ourselves with something from the past and claim it to be eternally valid. We chafe at this today. This is sandpaper on the culture in these two ways. We're asked to believe in a God we do not see, and we link ourselves to customs, habits, our liturgy, our languages, Latin, that are 2,000 plus years old. This situation of the challenge of belief today was very well summarized by Soren Kierkegaard, who I mentioned earlier, who was a philosopher, probably the first philosopher of existentialism in the 19th century. And he wrote a work called Either Or, where the choice was Christianity or paganism, which is what he was bringing to light at that time. And he describes the predicament of Christians today in a story of a circus who's coming to a town. And as circuses did, they camped out in the farmlands outside the village where they could set up their tents, their acts, all of the things that they'll do in the circus, the cages for the wild animals, right outside the village. But at a certain point, one of the animals kicks over a lantern and it starts a fire. The fire spreads into the town. It's heading toward the town. The head of the circus asks one of the clowns, who's half made up, half his face is painted, he's got half of his outfit on, run into the town and tell them the fire's coming. The clown does so. He runs into the town, and the people think it's coming attractions. They think it's entertainment. They are laughing at him, the fact that his face is half painted, that he's half dressed, and they ridicule him, and the fire burns the town down. No one comes to help. For Kierkegaard, this was our situation and remains our situation. The choice is pure, unadulterated Christianity or paganism. There is no middle, there is no in-between. Let me put a little more content to the Pope as he describes the dilemma of the visible and of the then versus now, that ancient origin of our faith. So the dilemma of the invisible versus the visible. Quote, in the Middle Ages, belief was a ready-made mode of life, by which for them that the exciting adventure really signified by the word credo, Latin for I believe, was at least as much as concealed as disclosed. This is simply because there's an infinite gulf between God and man, because man is so made that his eyes are only capable of seeing what is not God. And thus for man, God is always and will be essentially invisible, something lying outside his field of vision. God is essentially invisible. This fundamental assertion of biblical faith in God, in its opposition to the visibility of the gods, in plural, is at the same time indeed primarily an assertion about man. Man is a seeing creature whose living area seems marked off by the range of what he can see and grasp. Continuing, if this is so, then the little word credo contains a basic option vis-a-vis reality as such. It signifies not the observation of this or that fact, but a fundamental mode of behavior towards being, towards existence, towards one's own sector of reality, and towards reality as a whole. With my emphasis here, it signifies the deliberate view that what cannot be seen, what can in no wise move into the field of vision, is not unreal. That on the contrary, what cannot be seen in fact represents true reality. It signifies the view that this element which makes reality as a whole possible is also what grants man a truly human existence. Such an attitude is certainly to be attained only by what the language of the Bible calls conversion. Isn't that interesting how the Pope pulls out of this first dilemma that faith is not simply a belief in this or that proposition or doctrine, but a fundamental posture, which we will get back to. But it's a fundamental posture about what is real and what is most real. This is what we mean by conversion, a turning around from our normal, natural orientation to what's in front of us. The second dilemma of then versus now. Quote, the basic paradox already present in belief as such is rendered even more profound by the fact that belief appears on the scene in the garb of days gone by, and indeed seems itself to be something old-fashioned, the mode of life and existence current a long time ago. All attempts at modernization, whether intellectual, academic, demythologization, or ecclesiastical pragmatic aggiornamento, which was the term used at Vatican II for renewal, do not alter this fact. So all these efforts at modernization don't alter the fact of the ancient origin of the faith. On the contrary, they strengthen the suspicion that a convulsive effort is being made to proclaim as contemporary something that is really, in fact, a relic of days gone by. Belief no longer appears as the bold but challenging leap out of the apparent all of our visible world and into the apparent void of the invisible and intangible. Rather, it looks more like a demand to bind oneself to yesterday and to accept it as eternally valid. These are the dilemmas that frankly confront all of us. They confront the broader culture more aggressively, if you will. Certainly confronts candidates who come into the RCIA program as well. He goes on, and these thoughts are not necessarily original with the Pope either, though he gives them a certain expression that I like. The scandal of Christianity, and perhaps some of you have heard that phrase, the scandal of the cross, the scandal of Christ on the cross. But the scandal of Christianity heightens these dilemmas. How? We make some pretty bold claims as Catholics and as Christians, generally speaking. that God took a human nature in a particular time and place that was going to be definitive for all human history, all cultures, for all time. That's a very bold claim. You think of other religions, there's a little more hedging that goes on, a little more running room to allow for various interpretations. The other is that he is the exclusive mediator, that all grace that comes to the world, to the Hindu, to the person who's never heard of Jesus Christ or never heard of God, all graces to the world flow through Jesus Christ and the Catholic Church. That's another very bold claim. And it would be outrageous and arrogant of us to proclaim it, except for the fact that it's true. And we tend to pass over this if we were raised in the faith, that this claim that Jesus is the exclusive mediator between God and men is outrageous and a scandal. We could go on with this quote: the historical peculiarity of Jesus Christ is the scandal. Quote, "What I mean is this: Christian belief is not merely concerned with the eternal, which as the quite other would remain completely outside the human world and time. On the contrary, it is much more concerned with God in history, with God as man, by thus seeming to bridge the gulf between eternal and temporal, between visible and invisible, by making us meet God as a man, the eternal as the temporal, as one of us. It knows itself as revelation. Its claim to be revelation is indeed based on the fact that it has, so to speak, introduced the eternal into the world, our world. Quote, no one has ever seen God, the only Son, who is in the bosom of the Father, he has made known to him. Gospel of John, chapter 1, verse 18. God for us. I would say in passing, the Greek here is interesting. Transliterated, the term uses, Jesus is the exegesis of the Father. Jesus is the one moment in the history of the universe where the mediator equals what is being mediated. All our other knowledge, all our other experiences, all of the natural sciences, everything we do is always mediated by something else. Jesus Christ is the one time, the infinite, loving, living, true God. There's no interpretation. There's no buffer other than his human nature. Jesus Christ is the interpretation of the Father. Jesus Christ is God. Jesus Christ is the grammar of God. So just this once, what is particular expresses the infinite. Infinite love, infinite truth, infinite life. This is the scandal to the modern mind, that a historical figure does this. Seems kind of arrogant, exclusive, culturally bound to the Middle East and then later to the West and parts of the missionary lands of the East and South. Seems a bit arrogant, though, to make this claim, doesn't it? But Jesus makes known what otherwise is unknowable. As I mentioned, the particular revealing the infinite is contrary to our modern sensibility. You have heard these slogans. I have heard these slogans. I'm spiritual. I'm not religious. Religion divides people. The Spirit unites. It's all the same God in the end. These are slogans you hear in the culture all the time, television, movies, to stop you from thinking, to stop you from entering in the depths of what Jesus brings. At this juncture, the Pope asks a question, a very interesting question. Is Jesus too much? Even St. John Paul II asked, did Jesus go too far in his love for us, taking a human nature, living, preaching, suffering, dying, rising? It's too much. We can't handle it. Is he a stumbling block by making himself so vulnerable, not only in his life but in history, appearing in a particular time, in a particular place? Let me read this quote to you. The leap which previously led into the infinite seems to have been reduced to something on a human scale, in that we now need only take the few steps, as it were, to that person in Galilee, in whom God himself comes to meet us. But things are curiously double-sided. What at first seems to be the most radical revelation, the revelation is at the same moment the cause of the most extreme obscurity and concealment. The very thing which at first seems to bring God quite close to us, Jesus Christ, so that we can touch him as a fellow man, follow his footsteps and measure them precisely, also became in a very profound sense the precondition for the death of God, which henceforth puts an ineradicable stamp on the course of history and the human relationship with God. God has become so near to us that we can kill him. Not just on the cross, but in our culture. We can extinguish the divine from our culture. The Pope continues, thus today we stand somewhat baffled before this Christian revelation and wonder especially when we compare it with the religiosity of Asia, Buddhism, Hinduism, whether it would not have been much simpler to believe in the mysterious eternal, entrusting ourselves to it in longing thought, whether God would not have done better to leave us at an infinite distance, whether it would not really be easier to ascend out of the world and hear the eternally unfathomable secret in quiet contemplation, than to give oneself up to belief in one single figure and to set the salvation of man and of the world on the pinpoint of this one chance moment in history. Surely God thus narrowed down to one point is bound to die definitively in view of the world, which remorselessly reduces man and his history to a tiny grain of dust in the cosmos. Isn't that an interesting reflection? God's vulnerability to us in Jesus Christ, and the fact that that is specific in history with a particular message, content, community, also can be an obscurity to others because it's too specific. And the Pope muses out loud, would it not be better the way the Asian philosophies present deities or the infinite or the Tao of this eternal something which we all strive for, which is often reducible to Pilates and bumper stickers of coexist. But that's easier, isn't it? Much easier than a man dying on a cross with that hard message. You have all, I have done this, I'll admit this, where we'll run into people, or even ourselves, who say, God is mysterious. Where is he in the world? And then I'll read something like, if you want to be my disciple, pick up your cross and follow me. And I'll say, well, I need to put that into context of, maybe that doesn't mean exactly what it directly means for me. So we play a game. God, where are you? Why did this misfortune happen to me? God's not present. And then we're confronted with Jesus, and then we want to put him back into an infinite distance and context of, well, did he really mean pick up my cross and follow him? There's a nuance there that we should add. So you see, we play a game ourselves of infinite distance and the direct words of Jesus. So we'll pivot to this sense of agnosticism or atheism in our culture, the rise of the new atheism and the popularity of these books by Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins and others. Where is this coming from? Why is the rise of unaffiliated people from any denomination whatsoever, or Christianity as a whole, why is this happening? Why is mass attendance in Europe under 10%? On a good day, it might be 8%. If you've gone on vacations to Europe and gone into the magnificent cathedrals for Sunday Mass, there are more people walking the perimeter as tourists look at the Christians than who are going to Mass. I feel like you might be in a smoker's lounge and everyone's walking around outside looking at you like you are a problem because you're smoking or something. But where did this come from? Where did this divide and this feeling of loss come from? This is not original with Pope Benedict either. If you read books by people like Charles Taylor on the secular age or the sources of self, he very well charts where did the fragmentation of society and the individual from religion and from truth come from. And they both located somewhere in the 17th century with the rise of science, with the rise of discoveries in astronomy, which dislocated man from being the center and the earth the center of the universe. As these discoveries were made and we found out that we're not the center of things in the universe, that had a very disorienting effect, starting with Galileo and then later as that progressed. The Pope begins to talk about this in the context of some of the letters of Galileo to the church. And if you think about what was happening in the history of Europe at this time, in the 17th century, you had the long battles of what are called the wars of religion, which were really wars of nation states using religion. You had the French Catholics in league with Protestants fighting Charles V, the Holy Roman Empire. So often secular history will call these wars of religion from about 1530 on to about 1680 or so. But they're really wars of nation states, France, what we can call Germany, the Holy Roman Empire, Spain, Italy, the North countries, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, all fighting wars under the guise of religion. But in fact, it was to secure nation-state supremacy. So the Pope is speaking about these antagonisms. And what happened, starting with, say, René Descartes in the early 1600s, is how do we work out a philosophical program to stop us from killing each other? Can we agree? Can we all get along? So this is what the Pope is talking about. But at this point, speaking as a believer, I should like to make a proposal to those outside the church. In the age of the Enlightenment, really starting in the 17th century and catching momentum into the 18th century, the attempt was made to understand and define the essential norms of morality by saying that these would be valid even if God did not exist. We can't agree on God. We can't agree on revelation. In the situation of confessional antagonisms between the denominations, between Catholics, Calvinists, Lutherans, and in the crisis that threatened the image of God, they tried to keep the essential norms of morality outside the controversies and to identify an evidential quality, we'll get back to this, in these values that would make them independent of the many divisions and uncertainties of the various philosophies and religious confessions. The intention was to guarantee the bases of life in society, and in more general terms, the bases of humanity. At that time, this seemed possible since the great fundamental convictions created by Christianity were largely resistant to attack and seemed undeniable. So even across Europe in this time, the norms of Christianity still were in force. God exists, Jesus Christ was his mediator, his son. The norms on marriage were what we would associate with traditional values and public sexuality as well, and so on. The rights of the church, etc., etc. So with that, he continues. But this is no longer the case. The search for this kind of reassuring certainty, something that could go unchallenged despite all of the disagreements, has not succeeded. He's talking about now today. This attempt of the Enlightenment, starting in the 17th century, really ends with World War I. That's when the happy path, the happy dance of reason, no one believed it anymore. We just murdered millions of Europeans killed in the war. Who in 1918 thought optimistically about reason? Very few people. So, the attempt carried to the extremes to shape human affairs to the total exclusion of God leads us more and more to the brink of the abyss, toward the utter annihilation of man. This quote, I should mention to you, is taken from a book, Christianity and the Crisis of Cultures, and it's also in your bibliography. So with this, I thought a little humor at this point would be needed. Metaphysical lives matter. Metaphysics matters. You might say, Charles, you are out of your mind. And maybe I am. Maybe this will finally get you tired of me. But I want to give you an aerial view of 700 years of intellectual history in about 3 slides. But think of this as a Google map of what has happened from an intellectual standpoint. Obviously, philosophizing and doing theology never happens in a vacuum. You could point to the French Revolution of 1789, had a tremendous effect on how people did philosophy after that. You could point to the ongoing discoveries in the natural sciences. Planets were being discovered that were never known before, further dislocating man as the center of the universe and the earth as the center of the universe. Very disorienting. But Pope Benedict helpfully cuts this into 3 slices, and he characterizes it by a headline each time. The medieval synthesis he characterizes as verum est ens. Being is truth. Being can be known. The human mind and being are permeable. The human mind has the ability to know potentially all things, all being. Truth is a correspondence between my mind and reality. This is the classic St. Thomas Aquinas definition. If I say to you, the distance from Lake Forest to Milwaukee is 190 miles, is that a true statement? It is not a true statement. It's maybe more like 65 miles. What's going on? My mind is not in correspondence to the reality of the distance between Lake Forest and Milwaukee. So it's untrue. So truth is this wonderful convertible quality, as is good, the good and the beautiful, with being. And it is always knowable, potentially. Aquinas characterizes the human mind as a light shining on nature, created reality, to abstract, to apprehend. We even use the term apprehension. Not only to seize a criminal, but to understand. We're seizing. The light is shined on the ideas of God in matter. And we abstract those ideas to discover what is true. This was the classic medieval synthesis, which is the basis of all Catholic theology, by the way, the basis of our sacramental theology, of our moral understanding, our understanding of God, such as it is limited. Something happens with the modern era. The Enlightenment program, as I mentioned, which started in the 17th century and continued, frankly, until World War I. Virum quia factum. Truth is that which is made. You remember when the Pope talked about the moderns tried to find this evidential quality in human reason itself by which to establish norms for society and our self-understanding as a human being. We start with René Descartes. René Descartes is the father of modern philosophy, and he's considered to be an idealist. Sometimes he's called a Cartesian. But what's going on is modern philosophy in general, starting with René Descartes, begins in the mind. I need to start with clear and distinct ideas as a way of deducing true propositions. So the famous cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, is a hallmark of idealism in the sense of I must reconstruct the world from the inside out, from my conceptual scheme. And I have to start with clear and distinct ideas and go from there, like a mathematical deduction. And Descartes was a mathematician. David Hume comes along in the 18th century as an empiricist, which led to skepticism. All ideas you have to be traceable back to some sensory impression. And if you can't trace it back to a sensory impression, then it's a false idea. So he started to question all of our concepts of the soul, of the self, of God. What's the sensory impression for them? Causality. If I'm playing pool and I hit the cue ball into another ball, we naturally say, well, the cue ball caused the other ball to move, right? David Hume would say, no, what you saw was one ball move, you heard a click, and then you saw another ball move. You didn't see causality, you inferred it, you constructed it. Immanuel Kant will take this even further and make these categories of causality, substance, nature, God, as conditions of mind, of experiencing anything at all. The best examples to understand Immanuel Kant are things like latitude and longitude. Do latitude and longitude exist on the globe? No, they're constructs of the human mind to organize navigation and shipping. Does the Big Dipper exist as such? No, it doesn't, does it? It's not a dipper. The human mind associates a collection of stars, and we label it the Big Dipper, and then we experience it as the Big Dipper. And it's useful, again, for traveling. But that doesn't exist in itself. So Kant actually still has currency today. If you think this is just all historical, this understanding is very relevant in today's sciences, particularly in quantum mechanics. How the experimenter construes the experiment determines what you see, especially at the quantum levels or at the really, really big levels of when we're talking about the universe or black holes or dark energy. So Immanuel Kant in this thinking actually finds a companion in some ways in a lot of the very sophisticated natural sciences and physics today. What's the headline, though? So be happy, we just covered 500 years of history. The headline is, we see in this modern period a withering of the power of human reason. You've all heard the slogans that the Catholic Church is the enemy of science and the enemy of human reason. The Catholic Church is the only institution on the planet who believes the human mind, apart from revelation, can argue to the existence of God. No one else believes that or thinks that. So actually, in an interesting way, the Catholic Church is the only defender of the prerogatives and dignity of human reason. Let me keep rolling. Time check, good. We now get into something more contemporary with this cast of characters. I will be concise. With Hegel, he's basically saying, after Kant, why are the conditions of subjectivity by which we can know things, like latitude, longitude, why make them subjective? Why limit it to the human mind? That seems arbitrary. So Hegel is famous for this absolute spirit in history by which he works out through historical currents, epics, thought, thinking itself and its categories in history, almost in an Eastern philosophical sense, which Hegel and Asian philosophers, a lot of doctoral dissertations have been written about the connections between Buddhism and Hegel. What are good examples of this? But if you think about it, reason, capital R, sometimes people thought for Hegel that was God, is iterating clarifications throughout history. I'll give you a few examples to make this clear. Hegel, as he's charting the history of human civilization, notes the difference between the Greek and Roman classical world that was cosmological centered on the gods, centered on astronomy, to an anthropological world which Christianity brought. God made man. All of a sudden, man had dignity. He was not the plaything of the gods anymore. There was a paradigm move from the classical world of cosmology-centric to a greater clarification to an anthropological-centric view of the human person. Jesus Christ, then, is an example of absolute spirit in history. He's not definitive, but he's an example. And so Hegel developed all of the philosophical categories this way, of absolute spirit working out in history. You know this as, maybe you've heard this before, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Dialectical idealism. The next character, who we now celebrate his 200th anniversary of his birthday, Karl Marx, stood Hegel on his head. This quote is on his tombstone. Philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. Karl Marx took the dialectic engine of Hegel and put it into a materialistic, atheistic philosophy of history of communist revolution. That the thesis, antithesis, synthesis leads to a more pure form of society. We no longer need these relative things like Christianity, the existence of God. They are a means to an end. Feudalism, aristocracy is a means to getting to capitalism and bourgeois capitalism. Bourgeois capitalism is a means to getting to a worker's sense of his alienation from his labor. This alienation is a means for the proletariat to rise up, throw off the chains of its masters, and form a communist state. This is history, capital H. This is what communists worshipped. Lenin wrote a work right before he took over in the early 1900s on what is to be done, and he basically said, why wait? Why wait on history? We're going to start this right now. Interestingly, Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote a work called Cancer Ward, and one of the reasons he thought Marxism failed is it had no theology of death. This novel, Cancer Ward, was written in the 1950s. It was suppressed for a long time. And it charts the stories of 4 or 5 cancer patients who are trading stories about how they collaborated with Stalin before Stalin died. Some were police, others were in the court, lawyers, others were paid to clap and condemn a prisoner falsely, others gave false witness and testimony, and they were all collaborating in some way, and they were saying who was more guilty. And then finally, the figure that represents Solzhenitsyn says, we were indoctrinated for decades about the forces of history and the communist state, but we all die alone. So there are human experiences that cannot be contained by this communistic vision that Karl Marx promoted. And that novel, Cancer Ward, describes these. Marx sought to destroy bourgeois capitalism. Our next thinker, Soren Kierkegaard, on the next page, he sought to destroy bourgeois Christianity, which is why he was the first existentialist. So we're coming to the end, to our modern period now, of existentialism, which started with Soren Kierkegaard and continued through thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre, maybe you've heard of him, or Martin Heidegger. I won't go through all of this to be sensitive to our time, but right away in these thinkers, there's a sense that man is unique and man has been lost in all of these systems. And some of these writers are writing after World War I and also after World War II, that all of these programs that these countries come up with, both in Eastern Europe or the Germans and the Nazi Party, have done nothing but destroy humanity. They certainly haven't advanced the ball on civilization. Even with their latest technological developments, there's this brooding and there's this ominous feeling to what have we done to ourselves, which frankly we have not recovered from yet. You know, the Nobel Prize is named after Alfred Nobel, the inventor of dynamite. He had the same foreboding, the same, what have I done? Otto Hahn, there's a name for you, one of the fathers of nuclear fission, wrote the same thing in a diary on commenting on what have we done, and many of the participants in the Manhattan Project. What have we done? There's a sense that man, as in his full stature, has not been addressed by any of these philosophical movements. And these existentialists, many of them atheists, raise very interesting questions. They don't have good answers. There's something unique about man. Man is the only creature who can ask the question about his being, about the question of his freedom. For the existentialists, this is the unique way back to finding what is truthful. It eventually, too, does disintegrate. Can't be sustained. And these thinkers, though, offer interesting categories and concepts for Christianity, which John Paul II picked up in his Theology of the Body, in explaining the beauty of human sexuality existentially and using another school of thought called phenomenology. So where does this lead us all to? It leads us to academic faculties today in schools, number one, which reason is itself the enemy now. We've seen what it's done historically. Human reason is a toxic agent. It leads to convictions and commitments that destroy the human person. Appeals to universal standards are oppressive. I didn't touch on Nietzsche, I should have, but as the prophet of nihilism, nihilism is the negation of all universal truth claims as oppressive as will to power. Why? Because what Nietzsche notes in history is every truth claim, historically speaking, is making absolute what is relative. It's saying that Christianity is the only true faith. And if you don't believe it, well, you're going to serve a prison sentence, you're going to be tortured, you're going to pay taxes that no one else pays. And let's not just limit it to Christianity. So every time we do this in history, making universal truth claims for Nietzsche, it's just oppressive will to power. It's making absolute what is relative. What is the only thing that is absolute for Nietzsche? Man in his freedom to create his own project. Very popular today. Very popular in almost every academic institution in this country. So this is not just an academic sideline that I'm going through. This is what people are being taught and have been taught for the last 30, 40 years in schools. That even appeals to truth claims, there's something wrong with you. Why are you doing that? You're just oppressing. You're insecure. And so to handle your insecurity, you have to use this club of some kind of universal claim for truth. So we've now reached the point, and Nietzsche even talked about the nausea of reason, that it's disgusting. That appeals to truth are absurd and disgusting. So this is where we are. And so I'll tell a little story that the Pope tells about a childhood story in Germany they were told about Lucky Jack. Lucky Jack is a boy that is given a large gold piece from his father. Lucky Jack is 10 years old, he's feeling happy and proud, and he says, maybe I will buy a pony with this. So he buys a pony. But he finds out, I got to take care of the pony. I got to feed it, I got to water it, I got to have a stable for it. That I didn't plan on that. I'll sell the pony for some chickens because they can make eggs. We can eat, have eggs. So the chickens are hard to control after a while, and they have to be fed. And so he says, well, I'm gonna sell the chickens for a coat. So he buys a coat. The coat wears out, and after a while, he says, well, if I just had a stone, I could sharpen a knife I have. And so he sells the coat for a stone. The stone wears out, and after a while he's walking with the stone in his pocket and he just throws it into the field. That is what has happened in the last 700 years about human reason. We have traded down step by step by step by step. We have disconnected God from nature, God from creation, God from our human experience. Each step of the way it seemed like such a good idea. And we toss it away now because reason is the enemy. And in some theologies now, very popular in college campuses, the human being is the enemy of the planet. Where do you think this comes from? It comes from this trajectory that we're tracing. So with this, a quote from an article in First Things from 1993, How the World Lost Its Story. Quote, "The modern world, the world that instrumental and critical reason built, is falling about us." This is 1993. Modernity, it now becomes evident, has been all along eroding its foundations. Its projects and comforts have depended on an inheritance to which it has itself been inimical, hostile. The acids of modernity, as it turns out, the stones attacked by this acid have been those on which the modern world itself was erected. Modernity has lived on moral and intellectual capital that it has not renewed, and indeed could not have renewed without denying itself. We are parasites. We stand on the shoulder of giants and we reject the foundation, and we wonder why our societies are lost and fragmented, both in this country and in Europe. Just to finish this piece, we still, though, need the Christian stories that were provided by the faith, but we just secularize them now to get along so that we don't jump at each other's throats. Why should society get better? Through technological advances, improved standards of living. Why do we think that? The pagan world actually had a cyclical view of society and history and improvement, largely, again, through that cosmological orientation. The cosmos repeated. That was their sense of history. So the idea of progress is inevitable with the happy path of human reason. We know that's absurd. It gives us air conditioning. It gives us fast food. It gives us ATM machines. So what? So what? Are we advancing? The other secular myth today, which not a lot is really spent on this, why does anyone have rights at all? Why should I respect your rights? Maybe one reason is I respect them because I'll get caught. Thomas Hobbes. But is that a reason? That's just fear of getting caught. That's a pretty thin piece of toilet tissue to hold society together. What's the origin of my right to life? Ask someone that sometime who's an agnostic or an atheist or lukewarm in general. They won't be able to tell you. What's my right to anything? Is it all just positive law, what the government agrees to provide for? Is that it? So you see, pagan societies answered this question. Some people had them, most people didn't. So this secularized version of the dignity of the human person exists today in our culture, but without the baggage of a creator God who I got to be accountable to. Not that. Not that. Just because I'm a human being. How long will that hold up? So, let's get to the good part. Have I depressed you enough? Reclaiming our story. Interestingly, toward the end of this section of the work, Pope Benedict says, it seems pretty obvious that all self-made truth is no truth at all. No one can pull himself out of the bog of uncertainty, of not being able to live by his own exertions, nor can we pull ourselves up, as Descartes thought we could, by a cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. by a series of intellectual deductions. Meaning that is self-made is in the last analysis no meaning. Meaning that is the ground on which our existence as a totality can stand and live cannot be made, but only received. For to believe as a Christian means, in fact, entrusting oneself to the meaning which bears up me and the world, taking it as the firm ground on which I can stand fearlessly. To believe as a Christian means understanding our existence as an answer to the Word, the Logos, that bears up and holds all things. Christian belief is the option for the view that the receiving precedes the making, that what cannot be seen is more real than what can be seen, that meaning is the bread on which man, in the human part of his being, subsists. Without the Word, without meaning, without love, he falls into the situation of no longer being able to live, even when earthly comfort is present in abundance, namely our situation. The fundamental posture of belief is this bestowal, not a human construction, not a human manipulation. And as St. Augustine said long ago in the Confessions and elsewhere, I believe so that I may understand. Now, lest you think this is just some pious saying, the irony is all natural sciences proceed this way too. What I mean is no science demonstrates its own starting points. So you might say, well, Charles, what about physics? That's all based upon observation and experiments, right? Tell me, what are the experiments that establish logic and the rules of logic? Syllogisms, if A, then B, all A is B, some B is C, some... What, was that experimentally verified? Or how about mathematics? Does physics demonstrate the truth of mathematics? No, it doesn't. It assumes it. It assumes logic. So our highly exalted natural sciences that we all think are the true location of truth all start with premises that are taken on faith that are not demonstrated. And probably, as Aristotle thought, not demonstrable. Because if you have to demonstrate all of your starting points, you're in an infinite regress. There is no science then. So that's just a sidebar. If you thought this was, oh, now, Charles, this is where you're bringing religion in, and this attitude of bestowal precedes making. Well, guess what? All the natural sciences proceed the same way. What's different about Christian faith is its source is God and Jesus Christ. All righty, continuing. Pope Benedict wraps up this section with a wonderful way of bringing it back to our faith and belief today. Are you really he? Remember the story in Luke's Gospel. John the Baptist is now in prison. He sends messengers of his to Jesus. And he tells them, ask this person from Nazareth, are you he? Are you the one we're supposed to expect? Are you the particular that's going to reveal the infinite? Belief is in a who before a what. We'll mention a little more about that. Quote, are you really he? The question was asked anxiously in a dark hour, even by John the Baptist, the prophet who had directed his own disciples to the rabbi from Nazareth and recognized him as the greater, for whom he could only prepare the way. Are you really he? The believer will repeatedly experience the darkness in which the negation of belief surrounds him like a gloomy prison, from which there is no escape, and the indifference of the world, which goes its way unchanged, as if nothing happened, seems only to mock his hope. We have to pose the question, are you really he? Not only through honesty of thought and because of reason's responsibility, but also in accordance with the intrinsic law of love, which wants to know more and more him to whom it has given its yes, so as to be able to love him more. Are you really he? In the last resort, all the reflections contained in this book are subordinate to this question, and thus revolve around the basic form of confession. I believe in you, Jesus of Nazareth, as the meaning of the world and of my life. Isn't that a beautiful reflection on that scene from Luke's gospel? We believe a person before we believe the doctrine that person promotes. Now you might say, well, wait a minute. How do I select that person to listen to in the first place? I have to have some knowledge that precedes the who. This is the human manipulation first game of, well, human deductions have to occur before this bestowal, before gift. That's not true, as we've already pointed out. In fact, person always precedes doctrine. The who, the attractiveness of the who that calls me, always precedes what? Especially if he's calling me to a difficult path. We all have the experience of, I wouldn't have done this had I known. So too, when we follow Jesus Christ, we're very interested in the who and what he has to say. So this brings us to connecting to the rest of the program for the rest of this summer. We need to reclaim our culture. We know that to reclaim our culture is in the same way that we renew our relationship with Jesus Christ, as the Pope quoted at the end of that story. How do we begin to reorientate ourselves, given the dislocations of culture? Our next class is on the doctrine of creation. We're restoring verticality, as I call it, the transcendent to the everyday life we have. We live horizontally, we want to also live vertically. And so we'll talk more about the doctrine of creation in Class 2. Class 3 will be on the liturgy and the Mass. How do we heal the broken arch of the visible and the invisible that I talked about earlier, and the then and the now? You might say, Charles, what on earth are you talking about in the context of the liturgy and the Mass? Did you know that is the essence of what the Mass is from a worship perspective? Of course it is the holy sacrifice of the Mass, the sacramental representation of Calvary. Yes. But what is it doing? It's restoring and nourishing this dilemma of belief, of the invisible God being made visible on our altars, and the healing of the then and the now. To talk about the Mass and immediately slot it into, well, it should be in Latin, we'll miss the entire point of what the Mass is and what are we doing when we are at Mass. That's what I'll be talking about in Class 3. Then, and only then, will talking about Latin make any sense at all. To talk about Latin in itself is to talk about a museum piece. The fourth class is the church, the community and society of love and truth. This real communion we are to have with God and neighbor. The church is this community. The church is this instance of what is divine becoming human corporately and in society. Telling our stories, the other way I put it. And then our last class is death and the afterlife. Again, not talked a lot these days in preaching, but it needs to be talked about. And death as the passage to eternal life. And death as not this jolt, but rather a continuation of our life with Christ. So the event was the kingdom of God happening here and now. That's the jolt. That's the inbreaking of the divine into human history. Death is a passageway to life eternal fully with the God that has already entered human history. Seen from that perspective, of course, no one looks forward to death, and it's scary. But from the perspective of faith, we are already pilgrims. We are already experiencing the kingdom of God, and we will experience it fully after death. That's our last class. These are the elements by which, from the perspective and the writings of Pope Benedict XVI, we reclaim and restore culture, and we'll spend more time elaborating this. Now, we have a few minutes left. I threw a lot at you and wanted to give you a chance to ask questions on what we've covered so far. Yeah. So the comment was that Latin is a museum piece. You have to know I minored in Latin. I love Latin. But what I am talking about here is the prep work for people to appreciate Latin as it relates to the Mass. Often people start with Latin, and maybe I'm speaking to this audience, but I'm speaking to our YouTube audience who may not even be Christian. And so it's very important, or might not even be living in the West. We actually get hits from all over the world, China, India, parts of South America and South Africa. So my point to you and to the broader audience is if you lead with Latin and the Tridentine Mass, you might lose half of the population. So it's much better, in my opinion, and I'm leaning on the Pope now, all respect to Bishop Barron, is you have to start with what is the essential nature of the Mass. And if you think Latin is part of the essential nature, not only are you mistaken, but you would find fault with the Last Supper. Okay. Other questions? Yeah. A lot of material, but you can see where this has gone and where it's going. And I hope you'll find that in the classes to follow, we're going to touch ground a lot more on the core of our Catholic faith in these areas. When was the last time you heard a homily on creation? That you're not God. When was the last time you heard a homily on the essence of the Mass? What is the Mass? Or what is the Church? Did Jesus intend to start a Catholic Church? Or is that a power grab? And then lastly, death as a passage. When was the last time you heard a homily on death? I have a friend who runs 7 funeral homes on the northwest side of Chicago, a fairly large operator. His funerals are down 50% in the last 10 years. There's a reason for that. More cremations, or not even just anonymous ceremonies that are done. So we have a strange relationship with death in our culture today as well, and we're going to talk about it and what the Catholic response is to the questions we all have, as well as non-Christians have. Yes, and part of how we reclaim our culture is by proclaiming our foundational truths of our faith that we should be proud of, that society is in need of hearing. And probably the most common thing I hear from RCIA participants toward the end of the program is, no one ever told me this before. So we have a great story to tell. I'm going to tell part of it the best I can with Pope Benedict's help. But we have a fantastic story to tell. And to some extent, we've been browbeaten down not to tell it. So, well, with that, I want to be sensitive to the time. Thank you. I look forward to seeing you next class.